Okay, so this is chapter first pitch. Early the next morning, a middle aged woman named Evelyn Lincoln sat in the passenger seat as her husband, Abe, drove the car along Washington Street. Abe pulled up to the gate at the White House. The security guard didn't know Mrs. Lincoln. He took her word that she worked for the new president. I'll call you later, Abe said. Lincoln carried her briefcase to the West Wing, a separate building begun by Ted Roosevelt in 1902 when the White House ran out of room for staff. She introduced herself as President Kennedy's personal secretary. A guard led her down a hallway to a small room. I guess this will be your office, he said. She liked it. A window with a view of the rose garden, one door opening to the cabinet room, with its long table, bronze bust of Abraham Lincoln, a portrait of George Washington on the wall. Second door opened right into the Oval Office. She walked into the president's office. It really was oval. The walls were bare, freshly painted a drab green she knew her boss would hate. The glass in the windows were 2 inches thick, bulletproof. Tiny holes dotted the carpet, making a path for the desk to the door, from the desk to the door leading out to the lawn. Golf shoes, she realized. Eisenhower used to put on golf cleats at his desk and walk outside to hit a few balls. Good morning, Mrs. Lincoln. Is there any mail? A familiar voice. She worked for John Kennedy since he was first elected to the Senate 8 years before. The president came in and sat at the desk, getting the feel of the spot at the center of the power. This desk is too big, he said. He wanted his favorite rocking chair, the one that eased his stiff back, brought in and put by the fireplace. Plus, they needed a nicer sofa. Also, something would have to be done about the paint color. First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy had managed the remodeling, replacing the furniture, repainting the walls a warm, soft white, hanging family photos, and bringing in the kind of stuff her husband liked: naval paintings, ship models, and his favorite artifact, the coconut shell with the SOS message from World War II. Everything was ready just in time for the relentless string of disasters. 4 days after John Kennedy took office, the U.S. Air Force dropped 2 hydrogen bombs on North Carolina. Not on purpose. Shortly after midnight on January 28, 1961, 10 hours into the routine flight along the east coast of the United States, a B 52 bomber suffered a fuel leak, went into a spin, and broke apart as it fell. 5 members of the 8-man crew managed to eject safely and open their parachutes. The plane's 4 megaton bombs also fell free. One slammed into a wetland and buried itself deep in the mud without exploding. The other worked exactly as designed in case of a war. As it fell, a series of automatic triggers inside the bomb engaged. Just one single safety switch prevented detonation. The bombs each carried 200 types of power of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Radioactive fallout could have poisoned communities all the way to Washington, D.C. and beyond. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had been in the job 3 days. A month before, he'd been head of the Ford Motor Company. McNamara knew very little about hydrogen bombs, just enough to be horrified. By the slightest margin of chance, he later admitted, literally a failure of 2 wires to cross, a nuclear explosion was averted. A few weeks later in Miami, Robert Mayhew entered handsome Johnny Roselli hotel room with a briefcase in his hand. The CIA cutout sat on the edge of the bed, and he thumbed out a pile of cash, about 10,000. Roselli judged with an expert eye, just enough. He hadn't changed his mind. He wasn't asking to be paid for the Castro job, but there were expenses to be covered. Roselli had consulted with a few mobster friends, and they decided a guns blazing gangs-like style shooting would be too messy. Who'd be crazy enough to take that job? Instead, Roselli had asked whether the CIA could maybe get him some kind of poison. Government chemists produced a batch of 6 pills with what the lab described as high lethal content. Botulinum toxin, to be specific. The victim would be sick for several days before dying, making it hard to trace the source of the poison. After Roselli gathered up the money, Mayhew handed over the 6 capsules. They wouldn't dissolve well in hot soups or drinks, Mayhew explained. Cold drinks should be fine. The next step was to get the pills to the Cuban capital of Havana, where Roselli had a contact who knew a waiter at the restaurant where Castro often dined. How much did John Kennedy know about this assassination plot? That still that's still not clear, even now. Most historians think he must have been informed. In any case, that was just one of the several plans. Under President Eisenhower, the military and CIA had begun planning a far more ambitious operation to get rid of Fidel Castro, full-blown invasion of Cuba. On March 11th, standing before a map of Cuba on the podium in the cabinet room, the CIA's Richard Bissell updated Kennedy on the plan. 1,400 anti Castro Cubans were training at a secret base in the mountains of Guatemala. Morale was high. They were ready to go, but the Soviets were starting to send military supplies to Cuba. Castro was getting stronger, and rumors of an invasion force were starting to spread. Time was running out. The plan, explained Bissell, was to land the invasion force near the Cuban city of Trinidad. U.S. Air Force planes would fly overhead during the landing, bombing Castro's forces, while U.S. ships brought in supplies. Kennedy didn't like it. Sounds like D-Day, he objected. You have to reduce the noise level of this thing. Make it look more or less like an American operation, Kennedy ordered, more like Cuban liberating for their own country. He worried that a failed invasion would be a huge humiliation to the United States, and to him, personally, Kennedy wanted the option, if things went wrong, to deny this was an American-led attack. The plan had been a year in the making. Now the CIA and military had a few days to rework it. The revised plan called for a quieter landing, at night without air cover, at a rural spot on the southern coast called Bahia de Cachina. In English, a Bay of Pigs. Heard that thing before, the Bay of Pigs. Between briefings on Cuba, Kennedy slipped out to the lawn to toss a baseball. Opening day of the Washington Senators was coming up, and it was traditional for the president to throw a ceremonial first pitch. Kennedy agreed to do it, but his bad back made throwing painful. He wanted to get some practice in before the big day. There was news from Havana that week. Did you see the paper? A giddy Robert Mayhew asked one of his partners. Castro's ill. He's going to be sick 2 or 3 days. Wow, we got him. But Castro got better. The CIA never did figure out what went wrong. It's possible the waiter got scared and never used the pills, or maybe he got fired before he had a chance, or maybe Castro just stopped going to that restaurant. Well, there was always the invasion, set to begin in a few weeks. That should finish off Castro once and for all. On a chilly afternoon on April 10th, the stands of Griffin Stadium were packed for the Washington Senators opening day game against the Chicago White Sox. In his seat by the first base dugout, President Kennedy took off his overcoat, stood, and loosened up his arm. Players from both teams moved in close. They knew the drill. Important officials tossing out ceremonial pitches could never really throw. But everything was a competition to Kennedy. He wound up and he whipped the ball over the heads of the nearby players. It bounced off the gloves of 2 unsuspecting players, finally landing in a bare hand of the White Sox outfielder, Jim Rivera. The crowd roared. Kennedy smiled and waved and settled in to enjoy the game. That same day, in the mountains of Guatemala, Jose Perez San Ramona, Pepe, to his men, spoke to the 1,400 men he was about to lead into battle. Training was over. It was time. He told them to liberate their homeland. Cheering, singing patriotic songs, the men climbed into trucks and rolled down dirt roads out of the mountains to an air base. They got on transport planes for a night flight to Puerto Cabeza on the east coast of Nicaragua, the jumping off point for the Bay of Pigs invasion.